And now we bring you Killer Wives, episode 27, At Close Range. These are the case facts against Nanette Johnston, who had her lover killed by her boyfriend. Isn't trust a bitch? Santa Ana, California, famous birthplace of Michelle Pfeiffer, actor Michael Bakari Jordan, but also made famous for the death of one Mr. William McLaughlin.
Sergeant Central. 19 Sergeant. You have a call back for 86 into Central? Negative K, nothing further. Just see the cabbie in the corner.
On December the 15th, 1994, it was beginning to look a lot like Christmas. While better people were wrapping their gifts and awaiting that family-driven holiday, other predators were planning nefarious deeds such as murder for profit. Mr. William McLaughlin had just flown back from Las Vegas, Nevada, just in time to enjoy the season with his adult son, who lived in one of his houses, and his fiancée and future killer assistant. The two had met 4 years earlier after he had gone through a very messy divorce with his wife of 24 years at her request. Now, in a lot of these cases, it's the second woman that gets the guy, not the first. Mr. McLaughlin had become a millionaire by the age of 30 years after he invented a machine that could separate plasma from whole blood for the pharmaceutical community. Now age 55 and not willing to live alone, he answered an ad in a singles magazine where a 25-year-old woman was looking for a wealthy man. He paid particular interest in one woman's ad that read, "I am a well-educated, genteel woman who respects well-to-do men." The ad continued on by saying, "Take care of me, and I will take care of you." They got together and dated many times, and ultimately in less than a year of meeting this woman, he allowed her to move in with him in his brand new multi-million-dollar home. Within a month, she also brought her 2 young sons to live with him in a multi-million-dollar mansion. Now, almost a couple of years to the day they met, he proposed to her that they get married. Almost immediately after she began an affair with an ex-NFL football player. This would be the man she would ultimately groom to help her kill her brand new fiancé. Killer Wives investigations will reveal that much of what she either told him or promised him was a complete lie. She told the ex-football player that she was partners with Mr. McLaughlin in the business that produced the plasma machine to start with. That was a lie. She told the ex-football player that she did not have a romantic or physical relationship with Mr. McLaughlin, and that was a lie. Finally, she told him that she shared the residence with him only because they were business partners, and that sometimes he snuck in her room to sexually harass her and at one time tried to rape her. This too was a lie, one of the most colossal lies of them all. She was trying to stoke the coals of anger in the football player to make him mad enough, just mad enough, to kill her new fiancé. On the morning of the murder, the football player went down the street a couple of miles from the home of a multi-million-dollar Williams mansion from the murder scene that he killed him in, and made a duplicate front key to the front home. Now, this key alone would not allow the killer access into the fully gated community of the home, ranging in value from $2 to $10 million. No, this person would also need the community pass through gate key. Additionally, they would need some inside help from the form of Mr. McLaughlin's fiance about his time of arrival and whereabouts within the home. This murder was not a spur-of-the-moment thing. It was a plan that had been in the works for over the last year of the millionaire's life. McLaughlin, without his knowledge, had been engaged to a woman who wished him dead for profit. Sure, McLaughlin was worth over $55 million, and he owned 2 multi-million-dollar homes overlooking the ocean and a very wealthy community. In fact, he owned 2 homes in another state. But his biggest mistake was including Nanette Johnson in his will. Even worse was making Nanette Johnson the sole beneficiary of a $1 million insurance policy on his life. That night, the scene was set. She would attend her son's soccer ball game as usual to keep up appearances. Now, in attendance at that game was a football player with her on the sidelines. The only difference that night is she departed the game much earlier with the killer, a man she had been having a sexual affair with while being engaged to William. The affair was with Mr. Eric Napowski. Eric Napowski was a former linebacker with the NFL who spent stints on teams such as the New England Patriots and the Indianapolis Colts. He had the muscle that Nanette wanted, while William had the money that she desperately needed, because this woman was not wanting to work at any job for anybody. She just was out for riches. Now that night she would go shopping at a local department store away from the house to leave her safely off any list of prospective murders. She did not want to be somebody the police was focused on. On the other hand, Eric Napowski himself, although he worked as a bouncer at the Thunderbird nightclub, a mere 500 feet away from the front door of Mr. McLaughlin, he chose to go in the opposite direction. He needed to do this. Why? Now, just like William's fiance, he needed to establish an alibi to throw guilt off his back. So he drove his car over 20 minutes away to a phone call at the Denny's restaurant. He used a cell phone card where everyone at the time had a cell phone. Now, in this way, he would establish a time-sensitive alibi that could possibly save him from being the murderer at the time. The call he made was to a manager of the Thunderbird in order to corroborate his alibi with a living person. He needed somebody to say that he had called in at that particular time. The only thing he wanted to convey to the manager of the establishment was that he would not be late getting to work. He then drove his car at a high rate of speed to beat the normal traffic time it took to travel to the residence of his victim.
You're watching MNN, the Men's Channel.
He figured that if anyone measured that same distance in a subsequent investigation, it would not allow them to make that same time at normal speeds. Now, once he arrived at the edge of the wealthy community, he used the key that he was given by Williams' fiance to let himself into what was a very quiet, gated community, especially at that time of night. After walking just a few feet from that gate to Williams' residence, he used the newly minted key that he purchased early that afternoon from Ace Hardware to let himself into the front door. Upon entering that semi-darkened residence, Eric moved quickly to the kitchen where Mr. Williams had been lounging after eating a meal with his son in his White House robe. Mr. Williams must have stood up to confront Eric before he shot him 6 times at point-blank range. Now, Eric shot him in the chest and in the stomach. At least 2 shots fired at Mr. McLaughlin had been fired at least 2 feet away from the gun's muzzle. Here are the targets met at the hands of that particular killer. 1 bullet entered the right side of McLaughlin's chest before slashing the aorta and lung, then exiting through his back. 2 more bullets sliced his left lung, his diaphragm, and his stomach. Now this bullet popped out of his left flank. Another 3 lodged in his body after shredding his large and small intestines, his pancreas, his liver, his inferior vena cava, a critical heart cavity. Now, any one of these shots by itself would have caused death to Mr. McLaughlin. All of these explosive shots caused Williams, already in the throes of death, to fall backwards towards the floor. Now, in falling, McLaughlin slammed the back of his skull into the stove, creating a gash and splattering even more blood onto the kitchen floor. While insisting on committing the most perfect murder, what the former linebacker didn't count on was that there was another person in the house. Upstairs listening to his music was Williams' disabled son, Kevin. Kevin had suffered a closed head brain injury after being hit while riding his skateboard by a drunken driver just a few years earlier. When Kevin heard the shots ring out, as well as the commotion in the kitchen, he raced downstairs to see what was the matter. To Kevin's horror, he found his father lying dead in a pool of his own blood in the kitchen with 6 holes in his body. Now, the murderer had run from the kitchen, exiting the house through the security gate, but he did not run far. Former New England Patriot linebacker Eric Napolsky casually sauntered, zigzagging through the night, 500 feet away to his job at the club where he showed up to work on time. Amazing. Now, leaving what he just did behind, he knew that Williams' son hadn't followed him because it was too dark to see what direction he had gone. Back at the house, Kevin Williams' son, through the tears, immediately dialed 911 for police and paramedics. Kevin's first words to 911 operator are clear. Much of the rest isn't both, because anguish wailing in general tends to misshape words and because of Kevin's speech impediment. A second dispatcher comes on the telephone to help interpret. Kevin struggles to say, "Shot, shot, shot." Kevin is wailing at this point. Someone's been shot, but it isn't clear whom. At one point, the dispatcher asks, "Your dog?" Kevin retorts, "My dad, my dad." The dispatcher assures him she has captured his address and that help is on the way. But there is at least 10 minutes of wailing anguish as Kevin tries to answer her questions about where his father is and has been hit, whether he is breathing, whether anyone else is in there. Kevin now is not only in shock from having just found his father's bullet-riddled body, but suffering the most severe forms of frustration imaginable, desperately struggling to communicate the horror before him so he can help his father, even as he helplessly watches life slip away. As for Mr. McLaughlin's wife, her involvement in the murder was initially cleared based upon a Crate and Barrel receipt, which shows she bought a vase at a mall about 20 minutes after the shooting. How convenient this was. The McLaughlin home is about 10 minutes drive from South Coast Plaza Mall. So it's conceivable Johnson had been in Newport Beach at the time of the shooting. Now, police don't believe her alibi, but court records do not suggest Johnson was the McLaughlin home when he was shot.
You're watching MNN, the men's channel.
She made sure she covered herself, but nobody else. Now, oddly, in an interview with the Los Angeles Times shortly after the shooting, she said Mr. Napolsky, the ex-football star, was with her when it happened. Another wrinkle in the space-time fog that surrounded the killing of William McLaughlin. But subsequent inquiries into her wealthy fiance's bank account activities by her grown daughters would reveal some fraud. There was some fraud there. Not on his part, not on Mr. McLaughlin's part, but by his rather attractive fiancée. Apparently on the day of the murder, she had forged a check in the name of Mr. McLaughlin at the time and the tune of some $250,000 and deposited that check 2 days after the murder into her bank. To add insult to injury, she used those funds to buy her linebacker murderer a pair of genuine alligator boots and a brand new expensive motorcycle. Is it just me, or does someone smell a payoff for murder? She stole an additional amount of funds for the deceased account for a total of $385,000, almost $500,000. By this time, his daughters, the executors of his estate, brought criminal charges against their dad's former fiancée, and she would end up spending a whole year in prison for embezzlement, but not for murder. Without adequate evidence, detectives had no choice but to release the two people they rightfully believed killed Mr. McLaughlin. Sometimes in murder cases, this happens, but you gotta bring something to the courts that is soundproof. The fact that the murderer used house keys to enter the house instead of breaking and entering, the fact that one key was duplicate copy of the front door, but the 8 pass key was an original because it had stamped on it, "Do not duplicate." Do not duplicate keys usually are under the control of a community management and not the owner of the property. This means that he could not duplicate this particular key. he had to have the original key from Mr. McLaughlin's fiancée. You see, when investigators checked his fiancée's key ring that particular night, they noticed they had 3 keys, where she said she would have normally had 4. The 4th key that was missing was for that passgate key, which was stamped "Do Not Copy." The case would ultimately grow cold over the 10 years without solid evidence, and the murdering duo would go on to live their lives freely in separate parts of the country, in separate states. They enjoyed their lives. Now, after the decedent's ex-fiancée got out of prison, she would sue the family to get monies promised to her by his will. Ultimately, she was awarded $220,000 additionally. Now, this was given by the court in a settlement. She was not awarded the $1 million life insurance policy because there had not been enough time lapsed between the time he had applied for the policy and the time she had him murdered. She didn't know to wait out the time before you kill somebody. But as the saying goes, the wheels of justice grind slowly. They ultimately did this, and prosecutors got newer evidence and reopened the case. This led to a simultaneous arrest in 2 different parts of the country of the murdering duo. Now, in front of a courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and producers from 3 different television networks, prosecutors Murphy insisted at the preliminary hearing that the overall facts of the case are tremendously telling, citing, among other things, Miss Johnson's financial dependence on McLaughlin. The only asset she had was that man. That was it. He was her asset. She had stolen $350,000, he said. The $250,000 she admitted to, plus an additional $100,000 from him within 24 hours of the murder, and knew somebody would notice. She kept the $150,000 McLaughlin left her in a will. The charges against Johnston and Napowski alleged murder with the special circumstances. Now, murder for financial gain in this case, which made both eligible for the death penalty. Now, what about the license plate number of his notebook? In his notebook, there was a license plate number. Now, that was of McLaughlin's. Napowski says that came from a PI he hired to follow Johnson after he started having questions about her loyalties. Now, jurors knew Johnson had already pleaded guilty in 1996 to forgery and grand theft after stealing the nearly $350,000 from McLaughlin's bank accounts, including $250,000 in the day he died, and that she had been positioned to collect on a $1 million insurance policy if McLaughlin had passed away. Now, not been murdered by her. Murphy argued that Napowski had intended to marry Johnston and that he truly believed McLaughlin was just her business partner, despite the very public and consensual nature of McLaughlin's Johnston's relationship. So Napowski had been bold and defiant over the course of his 2 police interviews. They took him down and interrogated him. And this occurred within a month of the murder, and he changed parts of his story. Detectives asked him if he was not involved in Mr. McLaughlin's murder. Then what about the license plate number in his notebook? Why was the McLaughlin's license plate number in your notebook in the car when we arrested you? Napowski says that came from the PI he had hired to follow Johnson after he started having questions about her loyalties, which I told you a minute ago. Now, his most damning misstep, though, came after the first early traffic arrest in '94 when detectives asked whether he owned any guns. Napowski said he recently bought a Jennings 380 and had mailed it to his father. Then he came forward with information out of the blue. A detective testified in court, kind of, "Oh yeah, I had another gun." Napowski told detectives he recently purchased a Beretta 9mm, the same make and model later identified by a forensics team as the weapon that most likely had killed McLaughlin, but that he loaned this gun to a friend that was called Joe David Jimenez, who worked on Napowski's security team. Then when the police visited Jimenez's home, however, Jimenez produced the aforementioned Jennings 380 weapon, registered to Napowski's name, not the Beretta. So that was a lie. Detectives confronted Napowski in their follow-up interview. "Where is your 9mm? Napowski said, "I have no idea." They retorted, "You have no idea?" He answered, "That's my statement, and I'm sticking to it. I don't want to talk about that anymore." Now, just as damning were 2 incriminating conversations Napowski is alleged to have had with a neighbor who testified that Napowski first said he wanted to have Bill's plane blown up. He wanted to blow up Bill's plane. And then after the murder said, "Maybe I did it, maybe I didn't, and maybe I had someone else do it." Those statements were damning. Naposki also allegedly told the neighbor that the murder weapon was the same kind of gun that I own, and that a house key left at the scene had been made at the store down the street from the apartment complex, so they think I did it. But the police never said anything about these two facts. In court, Murphy pointed out that none of the details had yet been released to the public. Numerous driving trials showing that Naposki could have in fact reached McLaughlin's house with enough time to commit the murder, even if they stopped at the Denny's restaurant. The revelation that it would have taken approximately 1 minute to run from McLaughlin's house to the entrance of the Thunderbird club where Naposki started working only 2 weeks before the murder, that he could have made it on time. Now, as I said before, a notebook found in Naposki's car with McLaughlin's license plate number scrawled inside, plus testimony from one detective that Naposki didn't want authorities looking through that particular notebook when they arrested him. Now, the testimony of an Ace Hardware employee who claimed Naposki had asked him to design a silencer for his Beretta. All damning results. Testimony from a realtor who said that in the months before McLaughlin's death, when Johnson and Naposki had little money to their names, they shopped together for extravagant homes costing upwards of almost $1 million, suggesting they expected to collect on McLaughlin's life insurance policy. Now, on July 14, 2011, Naposki was convicted of murder. He was scheduled to be sentenced on October 21st of that year. However, on that date, sentencing was delayed until 2012. On January 23rd, 2012, a jury also convicted Nanette Johnson for the murder. On August 10th of 2012, Naposki was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The one who started it all, Nanette Johnson, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole as well by Superior Court Judge William Froberg. For Killer Wives, this is Charles Ricketts. We thank you very much for watching.